So I'm a professor in the biology department here at Loyola Campus. I do have an actual lab up in this building over here, but we are an urban ecology lab. So really, I like to think of the city of Montreal and particularly the green spaces of Montreal as our lab. That's where we're typically out in the field collecting data, doing our work. And what we work on are how the way that we use and manage green spaces throughout our cities, so all the green spaces from our parks, our schools, our campuses, our backyards, how those contribute to conserving biodiversity, so conserving other species, as well as providing what we call ecosystem services, or the benefits that people get from nature. So how beautiful trees like this silver maple here help to reduce hot summer temperatures, control flooding, provide shade, increase people's appreciation of their landscapes, recreation, mental and physical health. So we actually go out and try and collect data to allow us to measure and understand these things in the city around us. And I have two students with me here today who will introduce themselves a little bit more fully soon. We have Bella Richmond, who is a PhD student who works on thinking about urban forests and ecosystem services at a large scale across cities. And Mathieu Johnson, who is an undergrad student in Science College here at Loyola, who's been working on a research project at a finer scale, understanding how trees right around us here in this neighborhood can help to reduce summer heat. So I don't know if we want to pass it over to you or over to one of these folks now. Or if you have questions you want to start with me, we can. Maybe we could describe a little bit the frame that you had proposed in terms of project as ways of looking at the way that you measure data and how that kind of plays into larger. Yeah, sure.
Do you want me to go some smaller scale?
So I'm going to pass the mic on to Matt.
The mic, yeah.
And he's going to tell us a little bit about how we collect data at the open city.
I'm not on camera. There we go. Hello. So yeah, my name is Matt Johnson. I'm a undergrad student, like Carly said. I'm working on kind of the pretty fine scale of microclimate temperature. I have this wonderful little bike here. In this box is actually I can probably show you. It's a temperature sensor and a GPS sensor, and essentially I just bike around the neighborhood, and using these sensors, I'm able to. It's a mess of wires, pretty bad, but this little thing here, that's the GPS probe. We have a temperature probe in here. That's this little thing. It goes in this casing. And it's all connected to this data logger. And the data logger essentially every second will take both GPS and temperature data and record it. And then I will take that data.
Doug, we lost sound on Matthew.
Whether what trees are present and how big the trees are and how much canopy they cover, and just looking at all those variables and looking at how that will affect the temperature of the area to the scale of, like, you know, within a few dozen meters. So it's a really fine scale. Whereas a lot of research is done on, like, they'll look at an entire borough or an entire neighborhood or even an entire city. Whereas this specific project was really like, you know, what is the temperature here versus where there's a big tree versus, you know, halfway down the street where there's, you know, a couple little twigs and not much else. So that's what I've been doing this summer. Went out took some bike rides, and from that it created, you know, a fellow will be able to show you more actual data, not specifically about this, but you know, just data in general. But it created essentially just a map where I have points that have a temperature and a location, and you can see the points, the canopy cover, and just compare and look at how the canopy and the trees in general, the urban forest, how that affects the microclimate temperatures. That's pretty much it. Is there any questions?
Well, I have a question right away, which is that we had record-breaking heat waves for the last
Yes.
2 summers, and how has that driven your research or affected your research?
Well, so specifically the effects of like the ecosystem services that Carly was mentioning is specifically like cooling due to shade and like evapotranspiration are most visible, most clear when there's super high heat, because it's easier. You see the effects much more when you're cooling from like 35 degrees to 27 versus when you're cooling from, you know, 24 to 23. And a lot of these ecosystem services are even more important in terms of climate change and in terms of heat waves, because they help mitigate the extreme kind of like the pendulum swing, right? So in a heat wave, it won't reach quite as high. It'll still be hotter, but it won't reach quite as high if we are properly utilizing those ecosystem services and that you know, urban forest cooling that is so important. So it's definitely more present when there is heat waves and super high heat, and because those are happening more and more often because of climate change, it's more and more valuable to have a very solid urban forest.
Speaking about there's urgency around the data collection, and then I guess with Bella's project, we can kind of look at the way that feeds into these larger systems, because I think maybe what both of you are kind of getting at is this idea about how data impacts policy and impacts our use of public space. Yeah, that's the thing, because you know, you can do research on urban forests as much as you want, but as long as until the policymakers actually change how they plant the urban forest and how they manage the urban forest, there's not going to be much effect, because it's not researchers that are going out and planting street trees or trees in people's backyards. That's the public, and that's the policymakers. So that's why it's important to get this stuff kind of in the public knowledge. Maybe
Do I want to change over?
Sure, yeah, maybe we can look at Bella's work now.
Cool. I don't want to break things. There you go.
I think Doug is probably testing the
Do you
sound
want-
on that mic right
Yeah,
now.
I was like feeling it sprinkle. If you want my rain jacket,
So
Oh, no, it's
for
so
those of you here in the Zoom with me, don't be shy
it
about
a little
putting
canopy.
questions or comments in the chat here,
Yeah, we
and
got-
we'll make sure
Exactly.
Cecilia sees those.
Providing
it's not a
Rain
well-studied one, protecting technology from the rain, but
protecting Bella's very home.
I was out in the park the other day and it started pouring rain, and like everyone in the park just like ran under a tree. Oh, I wish I had like a picture of this of everyone standing under their own tree as like versus for public parking. Hey, but one that you can use.
Anna, can you ask Mike to unmute? I can't hear you though.
Yep, I have done it.
So
Should I press unmute
I
here?
think we're on, but I don't
no,
think we have.
that's not the right one. So it's okay. It's okay. We're gonna have to just abandon this back.
Margaret, is that format?
It's okay. We're good. We're good. I'm just gonna have to move closer. We'll use this other microphone.
Doug, we can hear your camera mic really well.
Yeah, no, it's okay.
Okay.
I'll come over. there.
Stay under your tree. Stay.
Stay. Need to be perfectly
I must
framed
live
onto
in
this
one
tree.
layer, yeah, all the time.
And Anna, can we hear okay here?
Yes, we can.
I'm just gonna move closer for Bella. Hi, Bella. Can you just say hi to us? We're good.
Hi, I'm Bella. We're going.
We're going.
It's
We're
happening.
good.
Okay,
Yeah, thank you.
Cool. Hi, everyone. I'm Bella. As Carly said, I'm her PhD student, and I'm kind of doing the opposite of Matt, where Matt was measuring on a 1 second by 1 second basis, like 1 meter by 1 meter. I'm trying to compare data from across 7 Canadian cities. So I'm trying to look at the ecosystem services or the benefits we get from trees across Canada, which requires a bit of a different approach because unfortunately Carly won't pay me to ride my bike across Canada. So the kind of data that I get is all from the internet, and it's sometimes referred to as big data. So it's publicly available data, often sourced from municipalities or remote sensing. So like I use a lot of data from satellites. So I can show you a bit of an example. Can you see my screen?
Yeah.
Okay, so this is the Halifax Open Data Portal. And so Halifax has a ton of data, not just related to trees, but and most cities do have some sort of public inventory where you can just download whatever data you're interested in onto your computer and run whatever analysis you want. So this is an example showing us Halifax parks across the city. There's another example here that I pulled up. This is all their publicly owned trees. So this is a perfect example of the kind of data set I would look at. And so I got the public trees from 7 different cities. I downloaded all that data and then am running analysis on it. And using this information, we can look at things like how do these public street trees affect things like temperature? And so temperature is the thing that comes from a satellite. So this is maybe a bit hard to see, but basically this is a global data set provided for free by a satellite. So just the different colors on this are different temperatures in these areas, and it's like a daily data set. So you get this data every day. So this is kind of what Matt is doing, but on a global scale. So it's easier, obviously, to get, or it's possible, I guess I should say, to get data across the world when you use a satellite versus a bike. And so it just like allows different approaches to use and different conclusions to be made if you can do this on a national or international or even citywide scale versus Matt biking around NDG, which is also super cool. And I'm jealous of his data because it's very fine scale. But yeah, so then if I pull that all into my computer, I can make maps that look like this, where we have our parks, we've got our trees, we've got our neighborhoods, and all of this comes together and allows me to compare, across Canada benefits that we're getting from trees, which I personally think is cool, but I'm pretty biased. Yeah, and then the other aspect of my PhD is looking at kind of the historical effects on the benefits we're getting. So trees are pretty old. They're planted a long time ago. So there's a lot of things that affect the benefits that we get right now from trees that were decisions made decades, centuries ago. So yeah, that's kind of our stuff. Yeah, our vibe.
Do you want to mention some of the socioeconomic side? And I think you might have questions on that, so maybe a brief intro to how
Yeah,
that
I mean,
fits
it's a
into-
super interesting intersection with the kind of history of like the City Beautiful and Green City movements and these social movements that had much more to do with aesthetics and the sort of wealth around urban planning and not so much around the idea of science and public health.
Yeah, for sure. I think that is really important to think about. I think something that is well established in the field of urban ecology is that the benefits that we get from nature are not distributed in an equitable way. So, like you said, movements to start tree planting in streets and in parks were really kind of started by wealthy neighborhoods, people who wanted those benefits and had the means to either plant them themselves or had the power to convince their municipalities and their government actors to plant them on behalf of them. And so there is a lot of inequity in Canadian cities and around the world on the benefits that we get from urban trees. And it's especially interesting because trees are so long-lived. So like, even if we plant trees right now in an equitable way, we're still experiencing the legacy effects of inequitable planting from the past. So it gets pretty complicated and nuanced when you think about it even on a small scale, like even going from the Loyola Campus to downtown versus across the country.
And I mean, when you look at just how impactful the urban forest can be on stuff like cooling, and it's really, really important to have it be equitable, because often in the places that have a lower canopy cover or a less developed urban forest are also the places where not everyone can afford AC, and not everyone can afford to actually properly keep themselves cool during these heat waves, and
don't have access to private green space.
Exactly, don't have access to private green space, don't have a yard to plant trees in the first place. Like, a lot of these kind of the intersectionality of it is really interesting, because a lot of these problems kind of stack on top of each other. And so places where you don't have a very, you don't have high canopy is also the places that are generally lower income and have all these other, issues that we have to deal with based on, keeping the inhabitants of those areas safe during, extreme heat waves and stuff like that. So it all kind of compounds itself.
I had a follow-up question about, I think you were mentioning the sort of desire to affect public decisions, individual, but also larger scale behaviors in cities. And what I see is the kind of, to return to the idea of materiality, which is the focus of these courses, what I see as the materials of your research practices are not only the fabric of the city, the physical places and data that you're gathering, but the ways that you translate them and make that data legible, and how you kind of see that affecting both kind of larger decisions, but what does it mean to compel individuals to kind of change their behaviors in the city, or to make a decision to plant a tree or to plant a garden, something like that?
Yeah, that's a great question. Maybe I'll start. And if either of you want to jump in, you can, I'm seeing some looks in my direction. So that's a really great question. And one of the things that is so challenging about working in an urban context is our cities are really cut up into all of these little different tiny pieces where you have different governance or different management over the land. So when we're thinking about the urban forest as just one example, who makes decisions and who plants those trees? Sometimes it's an individual landowner, sometimes who lives in that place, sometimes it's a landlord of a renter, sometimes it's the city planting on streets, or the parks department planting in parks, or Concordia planting on our campuses, for example. And so you're trying to reach out and to convince many, many different rights holders and stakeholders across the landscape. And that's much more difficult in some ways than if you had one person in charge of everything, that you could just get that information to one decision maker. But on the other hand, it gives you different ways different people will be influenced by different arguments. And so it really speaks to the importance of science communication and of being able to actually translate those results in a way that people will understand. And that's really where a lot of the field of ecosystem services comes from, is this idea that, okay, we know trees are doing a lot of good. I'm picking on trees, but really all of our green spaces are doing a lot of good for us. But our work to actually go out and try and measure that and put some numbers to it can be incredibly compelling from a decision-making perspective. And so if I can go to a decision maker, whether that's a decision maker at the city or someone right here on Loyola campus, and say, look, we have data that shows if we reach this canopy level, we'll make this difference in temperature, or this difference in stormwater, or this difference in people's kind of mood and health and appreciation, then that's a powerful piece of information that can be built into a policy or put into a plan or a target in a way that just telling someone like, hey, look, aren't trees great? Might not quite get them there. Now, when you're talking to a person one-on-one about their yard, maybe the argument is, look how beautiful and wonderful these trees are, aren't they great? And that might be enough to convince someone. So having different communication strategies for different people, I think, is really important. And that's why we also try and research multiple benefits. So these two have been talking about temperature today, but we can also think about air quality, we can think about flood regulation, we can think about food, we can think about pollinators. There are all of these different benefits that we get from our natural environment that we don't necessarily think about until someone brings it to our attention.
I think it's also, if I can just jump in,
Sure, yeah.
I think it's also super important to make it easy on whoever's going to make the change, because I hate to say it, people in general are pretty lazy. So
Or busy.
busy, yeah. If it's easier to make a change and to plant, like there's research going on in our lab where essentially one of the lab members was putting together a list of just native pollinator friendly trees and plants and shrubs and and just putting them in a big list and to distribute that to make it easier, because if you need to spend 3 hours doing research to see what is going to grow best and what is going to be most pollinator friendly and what is going to be native to your area, you're not going to end up doing it. A lot of people won't end up doing it. And so making it easy and communicable to the general public and to the policymakers is a big challenge, but it's super important, because if you can say, if you want somebody to make a change and you say, look at this data and make conclusions and do all this analysis yourself, versus look at this data and look at the conclusions that we've already made and look at this very clear, causal link that we've already established. And if you present it to them like that, it's going to be easier for them to make the change that is necessary than if you're going to just say, trees are good, do your research, plant some trees. Like, you have to make it easy for them to do it.
And maybe you could speak a little bit. I know Kaylee's not with us today, but I know there was some interest in the NEC tree project and what it kind of the experience was with getting residents involved in actively gathering data about the urban forest, how that kind of shifts that relationship, not only from communicating the information, but getting people invested in helping gather it and helping kind of zero in on this micro scale of detail.
Sure, yeah, absolutely. So if you remember a few minutes ago when Bella was showing her data, she was showing examples, like Halifax you were showing.
Yeah.
But same thing in Montreal. So you had images of street trees, and street trees are something we tend to know a lot about. Most municipalities have good records of their street trees, but we also know that 50% or more of our urban forest is actually planted on private land. And so that's places like campuses, places like people's yards. And we have almost no information about those trees at all. We don't know what species they are. We don't know how many there are. We don't know how big they are. And that makes it really difficult for people like us to actually do the science to say, here are the species of trees we should be planting, or here are the benefits we're getting in different places, because we're working with half a data set all the time. And so what Kaylee, who's not here today, really was interested in for her master's thesis was to start understanding, are these trees on private land, both institutions and campuses, but also people's yards? Is the public tree data representative of what we see on private land? And so she did this using a combination of fieldwork, but also community science, where, as Cecilia mentioned, we actually had people going out, taking a measurement, taking photos of their own backyard trees to send us so that we could then use that data. And community science is a method that we use often in the lab for collecting data that's maybe distributed in lots of different locations and hard for us to go and gather and access, but also it's a really important way of bringing people into the research you're doing and helping people understand the process of science and how that works. And in general, she had about 100 residents throughout NDG, throughout the neighborhood, that went out and measured their trees and sent their data in. And the experience of most people, I think, was pretty positive. They either they were already quite knowledgeable and wanted to share that knowledge with us, you know, they know what trees they have, they care about them, they planted them, or on the other end, they've never even thought about what kind of tree is in their backyard. And this was a really interesting learning experience for them and often for their kids as well, for people with young kids to understand, oh, what is this growing in our yard? Can we learn more about it? What is it doing to benefit us? And so I think it really spans the gamut from people who are already very knowledgeable and giving them a way to contribute that knowledge to something larger, to the other end, really giving people the tools to understand their environments better. One of the main challenges, of course, is, you know, people are busy. Everyone has lots on their plates already. There are a lot of people who think, oh, this is a great idea, but actually finding the time to go out and collect data and send it in can take some prodding and some nudging. And so you definitely have to have a strong communicator in charge of a project like that to really get people engaged.
And do you see long-term partnerships growing out of that, or is there a way for people to become kind of involved beyond a single project? What do those partnerships look like?
Yeah, ideally, we would like to develop some longer-term partnerships. So we do work with local NGOs and organizations in the city as well, particularly friends of groups, so like friends of the mountain, friends of Park and Greenville, who are interested in more of a sustained relationship with the lab. But certainly, we would be interested in developing some of these longer term partnerships and potentially going back and remeasuring some of these variables over time. Because the lab is relatively new, we've kind of just started that process of thinking through, you know, what's the best way to do this. Some things work, some things don't, but we do hope to keep working with people in the neighborhood long term for sure.
Practical question for all of you, which is that in arts and humanities, the kind of theoretical cultural construct around nature is that it is something separate from the city, and that's something that there's for a while now been a lot of work to kind of deconstruct. Again, from the arts and humanities side, I'm curious about if this idea of nature versus urban space is that a framing that exists within the sciences? Is that something you find yourself butting up against?
Yeah, so I would say, I'll let these two answer as well after I do. I would say, certainly for a long time, ecologists, there have been ecologists studying nature in cities for decades, for much longer than we sometimes give them credit for, dating back to, you know, for example, post-war Berlin and botanists going out and studying, you know, plants growing in the rubble is kind of where some people think the field of urban ecology grew from. But certainly, and especially I think here in Canada, there does seem to be this perception of like, oh, cities, there's like, you know, if you want to do ecology, you go like out to the boreal and go study, you know, the forests and the caribou, which is very important that people should be doing. But there is absolutely nature in our cities. And I think that idea that cities and people are somehow separate from nature is a really damaging idea, and has led to us perhaps not taking care of and not really thinking seriously about the nature that surrounds us. And just, you know, very objectively, if we look down right now, we have leaves falling on the soil. These are going to be decomposed by all kinds of critters. They're going to change the nutrient composition. That's going to influence this tree. You know, I'm standing in an ecosystem right here, even though there's, you know, sidewalks and buildings and everything else surrounding us. And so a lot of the work that we've done, get some leaves in your viewpoint there. A lot of the work that we've done is really in my lab is showing, you know, we do see ecological processes happening in cities. These are, you know, functioning green spaces that can conserve species. We have 170 species of bees just on the island of Montreal, for example. And so I think that idea is starting to break down. And I think particularly over the last few years, as more people are kind of confined close to home with COVID and have started exploring their local green spaces, we've seen a little bit of a kind of resurgence in this idea that, oh, urban green spaces actually, you know, are really important and we should be protecting them and we should be valuing them to a much greater extent than we have. And so I'm cautiously optimistic that we're heading in a good direction, but I do think that view of nature as like something we go find somewhere else is particularly damaging. Absolutely.
Yeah, I think it's really hard to tease out the start of ecology was the separation of man and nature. It was a colonial ideal that arrived with the Europeans, and that pristine wilderness is and nature exists when there is no one there. And so that was the foundation of ecology. And so I think it is hard to get away from that. And I think that is why urban ecology is really cool. I think that from the beginning, it moved away from that. Like it has to, well, I guess it doesn't have to be, but it's very difficult to hold that ideal and also study nature in a city. Like even when you just go out and do field work, you are interacting with people. People come up to you. There is no separation between nature and humans in a city. And so I think, well, I guess I hope that urban ecology kind of just its existence is starting to deconstruct that very, very harmful idea that nature and humans are separate, because I think that has done a lot of damage. And I think it is a uniquely Western science ideal.
I think also people forget the fact that humans are animals as much as anything else is. So they forget that we need oxygen, and so we need our plants to take in CO2 and put out oxygen. Like as much as yes, anthropogenic kind of views of ecology are important. It's also important to realize that as humans, we are also part of the ecosystem in and of itself. Like it's kind of, I think it's important to realize that you have urban ecology and you have ecology, like, you know, if you were going out into the boreal forests or whatever, but the mechanisms and the base kind of characteristics of those ecosystems are somewhat transferable as well.
Yeah, it's funny, time and time again, people do studies, and every single time it's like when humans are in nature, they are happier. They're and it's like, oh yeah, this is where we belong. There is no hierarchy.
Yeah. It's almost like we're animals, and animals like being in nature.
Yeah.
So I guess one final question. If your research could impact or change in one way how people view or interact with their kind of daily urban environment, what would that be, ideally, for you?
It's very,
That's a big question.
yeah, it's a very,
Yeah.
very existential question.
I'm sure there's thousands of
Yeah,
answers.
yeah.
I'll start and I'll let these folks think about answers with respect to kind of their specific projects. And I think for me, I'll build on what we were just talking about. If my research could change one thing for people in the city, it would be realizing that you do live in an ecosystem, and the actions that you take to steward that environment are having a serious influence that scales up. And so to give people some agency over what you plant, the way that you move about your life in the city, the way that you vote, the way that you make decisions is having a huge influence on the nature that surrounds you. And I think it's important that we see ourselves as change makers within that system.
I guess I would say that I don't know if my research will do this, but it would be so awesome if it did. To realize that we are in a designed ecosystem. And so this ecosystem manifests all the problems and the inequities and injustices that our society already perpetuates. And so when we have a system that's entirely managed by humans, even though trees are amazing and they don't do anything wrong on their own, it's going to perpetuate all the injustice and inequity that already exists.
Yeah, I think if just, you know, urban ecology in general, or ecology in general, or urban science in general, like if it can change people from voting and putting policy in place and building only for money to building for sustainability and voting for sustainability and, you know, long-term survival of the ecosystem, and that includes humans. Because I think a lot of the time, a lot of ecologists get a lot of pushback of like, yeah, but how does this make things cheaper for me? How does this make my, how does this lower my taxes? Or how does this lower the cost of running a city as far as policymakers go? And if people can kind of, I think a lot of urban ecology has hopefully has the eventual goal to bring people away from thinking only about short-term money and goals into long-term kind of sustainability and survival.
We have really big goals.
Yeah, we want to change the
I'm
world.
glad I have very ambitious students here who are gonna, change the world one straight tree at a time.
Yeah, exactly. One bike ride at a time.
And thank you all so much for sharing what you do. I think you've really framed out the importance of your work.
There are a couple of questions on Zoom. I'm not sure.
Yeah. Anna, we're going to turn it over to you. We missed your intro because we went right in, and maybe I'm going to, if I reverse the camera, and then you, hello, there you are.
Yeah.
So everyone can see me. That's what I was. Unhook myself here. Hold on, I'm going to switch the mic, I think, here. Just a second. Can you just give a little sound check here, because we're going to try and do a two.
Yeah.
Can you say hello?
Hi, Carly. Hi, Bella. Hi, Matthew.
Quite quiet. Sorry.
Okay. Okay.
As loud as we can get.
Let's.
Okay.
Can you guys hear me? Okay.
A little bit.
Yeah,
Not
a little bit.
Barely.
I'll try to speak very loudly. We did have a couple. We did have a couple of questions in the chat. If you still have a few minutes to attend to them.
There were a couple of questions from the chat. Here, I'll just I'll rephrase. How about this? You guys can stand back.
Translate for us here.
Okay.
Oh, okay, I've got, but we can see you, Anna. So
You,
we just can't hear you for various reasons. Okay, go ahead.
The first one was
First question.
Was from Louis Felix, who's wondering if basically, aside from temperature, he's wondering if you also collect data from the air, especially in terms of radio waves.
Aside from temperature, he wants to know, he's interested to know if you would also collect. Oh, maybe we can hear you with the iPad. So I'm gonna mute myself here.
So many inputs.
I think we're gonna get some feedback.
Yeah, we definitely.
Just a second.
Louis Felix asks, your research looks at different aspects of the ecosystem you study. Aside from temperature, I'm wondering if you also collect data from the air, especially in terms of radio waves that our electronic devices emit, Bluetooth, Wi-Fi, telecommunications. I wonder if and how these affect our ecosystems.
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I think we definitely look at air pollution in the lab, but not necessarily radio waves or Bluetooth waves, more like nitrogen oxide and carbon monoxide and ozone that are emitted from cars and other kind of source pollutants in the city. So that's like also one of the things I'm trying to look at across Canada. I don't even know if I've seen any data sets on like Bluetooth.
Well, it'd be hard to gather that data.
Yeah, I'm trying to think.
Yeah, none that I know of offhand, particularly about those kinds of frequencies. I mean, certainly there are other, human and technology caused pollutants that we think about. And so noise pollution, for example, is another thing that we've started to look at in the lab using, sensors, open source sensors like audio mods that you can put out in around the city and collect noise and see both how does green space and nature kind of dampen city noises, but also are we bringing kind of nature-based noises into the city, like birdsong, rustling leaves, which have been shown to improve people's moods. Light pollution is another big one that our lab personally hasn't worked on yet, but is an interesting topic in urban ecology to think about how light pollution from buildings and street lights, particularly is affecting animals and migratory animals who maybe get confused or distracted by lights in our cities and can change their behaviors. And so there are definitely ways through technology that we influence the world around us in the city that we might not be thinking about.
I think there's also lots of really good research, again, not in our lab, but there's a lot of research on like the cultural impacts of like green spaces and those ecosystem services. So things like, do people look at their screens less when they're in parks? Like that kind of thing is definitely being studied, and there's a lot of cool research on that. And like your mental health when you live beside a tree versus not. But yeah, that's an interesting question. I haven't actually seen that specific data set.
Have any other
Yeah,
questions?
there was one more question in the chat from Brian Lynn. Do you folks draw from alternative pools of knowledge like Indigenous communities and maybe Indigenous science traditions?
That's a super important kind of aspect of science that a lot of people. I'm taking a course, like a seminar course at Concordia right now, talking about kind of intersectionality in science and looking at the importance of other voices in science as well, because a lot of science is colonizer science, like it's just white men doing science kind of thing, and it's super important to start breaking that down. I don't know how much, I don't know how much in our lab we do that. I also don't know how much in our lab we really like trees are trees kind of thing.
Well, I think that's a really interesting question. I think to do research with Indigenous people is a real honor, and also it's an extremely important responsibility that you can't just like. It would be incredibly inappropriate for me to take on an Indigenous worldview and try to do science through that worldview. I think it is extremely important to just have Indigenous people doing science. Not to say that that doesn't belong in our lab. I think there is an interesting misconception about cities that like Indigenous people don't live here, which is not true in any way. And so there's a lot of ecology research that does like really have really important relationships with First Nations and Métis and Inuit people. And there's a real lack of that in urban ecology. And it's interesting just because of like the way that this land is specifically set up. Like there's not, for example, reserve land usually within a city, like in Montreal, for example, but there are Indigenous people here. And of course, we are on Indigenous land. So it's a really interesting question.
I think also,
I'll jump in there a little bit. So I think what Bella's saying is that it's very true that urban ecologists have sometimes maybe let ourselves off the hook a little bit in terms of building those important partnerships with Indigenous peoples, because we have this misconception that, oh, well, we're in the city, we're not, out on the land doing science. And that is, again, that's not true. We certainly do need to be building those relationships. In terms of the work in the lab, I would say in a broader sense, yes, certainly some of our work has engaged with multiple ways of knowing. And so I'm thinking particularly about larger workshops or projects I've been involved with. For example, I'm involved in a project right now led by Carleton University on building equitable cities for people and nature. And that brings together both natural scientists, social scientists, healthcare practitioners, Indigenous leaders and knowledge keepers to kind of discuss together what do we see as important and what are the main knowledge gaps for moving forward towards equitable cities for people and nature. And those Indigenous perspectives have been incredibly important. In terms of building those relationships in Montreal, that's something that we haven't done yet, partly because our lab is relatively new and these relationships need to be treated with time and respect. And it's not something you can kind of snap your fingers and say, okay, I'm going to go and collaborate with the Indigenous community, but it's certainly something we keep in mind as we do our work. And I think there's a really, really important role for urban parks and green spaces towards promoting reconciliation. So, for example, the city of Vancouver has actually hired their first reconciliation planner within their parks board. That's Rina Sutar, and something that I've been fortunate to hear her speak about that really has stuck with me is that parks are an incredible, they're an expression of culture. The way that we design and manage and use our parks reflect the culture of the people who have designed them. And so what, better place in the city to start kind of reorienting our views and start bringing in other perspectives to promote reconciliation and to promote cultures of people who we have, likely removed from that land in the first place. And so they've been doing a lot of this work in Stanley Park in Vancouver, for example. And I think that's a perspective that we need to start thinking about much more broadly in Canada in terms of our urban green spaces and natural spaces. And there are some good templates to follow, certainly, in the city. That's something that I hope to remain kind of and become more engaged with moving forward. And I think that question broadly is a really important reminder that as we do our science, we need to think really critically about whose viewpoints and perspectives we are kind of holding up and taking seriously, and who we are dismissing in the way we do our science. Because as Bella mentioned earlier, the way that we manage these urban ecosystems really perpetuates a lot of the structural inequalities we already see in our society. And so bringing in more voices and more perspectives is only going to move us forward in a more positive way.
I think also, like Bella said, it's really important not to just kind of interpret other cultures' ways of thinking as white people and use that, but to instead like include them in the science by deferring to them instead of taking their culture and running it through our kind of biased filters.
Yeah, there's an important role for collaboration and co-production of projects in the city, just as everywhere else in ecology.
Thank you. I think that's it for our questions, Anna. I think.
Yep, that's it. That's it in the chat here. Thanks so much for attending to those.
I'll mute my mic.
Okay, so I guess, folks, on that note, we will close up this meeting. We will invite you back on Wednesday when we visit Nathan Brown's lab. I do believe this was the second and last outdoor lab walk meeting space. So thanks again for navigating those audiovisual challenges with us. It's a little bit difficult when we're outdoors, of course. So hopefully it'll be a little bit smoother moving forward. But it was still wonderful to be able to connect with Carly Ziter and Bella and Mathieu and their lab on site at Loyola outside of the SP building. So we thank them for their time, and we thank you for joining us in the Zoom space here. I'll send the invitation, the Zoom invitation event listing for the next one today, and hope that you can join us again on Wednesday. So on that note, I'll say goodbye to all, and have a great afternoon or rest of your day, and see you on Wednesday. Thanks. Bye. Cheers.